In front of the whole floor, Vivian Cross slid a folder across the conference table hard enough that it skidded, and fixed her eyes on Marcus Dean, her best strategist, and a single father raising his son alone. She let a small, cold smile show. "You really think anyone out there would pay you what I pay you? If you're so good, quit. I dare you." "You won't." A few minutes later, Marcus quietly lifted an empty paper box onto his desk and began clearing it out, one item at a time. Vivian's smile slipped. For the first time and longer than she could remember, something like fear moved through her chest. What would it take to make this careful, quiet man finally walk away? Cross Enterprises took up the top 11 floors of a glass tower downtown, and everyone who worked there understood the unwritten rules. You arrived early. You left late. And you never, under any circumstances, made Vivian Cross look like the second smartest person in the room. For most employees, that was simply the cost of a good paycheck. For Marcus, it had become a kind of daily discipline, a practice of swallowing what he actually thought and doing the work anyway, because the work was the one thing nobody could take from him. Marcus was 38. For almost 7 years he had made a living out of turning other people's collapsing ideas into things that worked. He was the man they called in when a launch was 2 weeks from falling apart, when a client was ready to walk, when the numbers quietly stopped making sense and nobody wanted to say so out loud. He never raised his voice. He never chased credit. He solved the problem and moved to the next one, and over time, the whole company had come to depend on him without quite admitting it. Theo Marsh, who sat 2 desks away and had learned half of what he knew from watching Marcus work, liked to joke that the company ran on 2 engines and only one of them appeared on the org chart. Nobody laughed at it like it was only a joke, because they'd all seen the pattern too many times to call it luck. Vivian had seen it too. That was exactly the problem. She'd clawed her way to her fortune through rooms full of men who assumed she'd fail, and somewhere in that long climb she'd decided a company was only as strong as the person at the very top. A star employee, to her, wasn't an asset, he was a risk, living proof that the machine could run without her hand on every lever. She'd spent too many years being underestimated to ever risk becoming replaceable again. So she watched Marcus the way you watch a rival you can't yet fire, and she made sure he knew his place. She had a particular contempt, never spoken aloud, for the fact that he was raising a household by himself. In her mind, it made him predictable. A man carrying that kind of weight didn't gamble. He didn't walk away from a paycheck. He endured, and a man who endured, she believed, could be pushed exactly as far as she wanted. For years she tested that theory in small, deliberate ways. She'd strip his name off a proposal and present his strategy as her own instinct. She'd let him carry a project to the finish line, then thank a junior staffer for the win right in front of him. She'd correct him on points he'd never gotten wrong, just to see if he'd push back. When he never did, she took his silence as proof she'd read him correctly all along. Marcus absorbed all of it without a visible crack. Every morning on the drive-in, he told himself the same thing. The money mattered more than his pride, and there were people at home who made his own feelings a luxury he couldn't currently afford. It was a reasonable thing to tell himself. It had gotten him through a divorce and through the long, grinding work of rebuilding a life on a single income. It had never once failed to get him through the door. But reasonable things wear thin when you repeat them long enough, and lately he'd started noticing the cost. He noticed it in the way younger staff had quietly stopped expecting fairness, having learned from watching him that talent was something you gave away for free in that building. He noticed it in a tiredness that had nothing to do with hours worked. And he noticed it most on the days he did his best work, because those were the days Vivian seemed most determined to prove that his best was worth nothing. The breaking point arrived disguised as an ordinary Tuesday. A client account worth nearly $4 million a year had been quietly falling apart for a month while the team assigned to it insisted everything was fine. It wasn't fine. The client was 3 days from signing with a competitor, and the only reason anyone even knew was that Marcus had spent 2 sleepless nights reading between the lines of emails nobody else had bothered to read closely. He rebuilt the entire proposal from scratch, caught the pricing mistake that had insulted the client in the first place, restructured the deliverables, and personally wrote the recovery pitch that Vivian would deliver. He did it without being asked, and without expecting thanks. He'd long since stopped expecting thanks. He did it because he couldn't tolerate watching a good account die over someone's pride. The pitch worked. The client stayed. For a few hours the floor buzzed with the particular energy of people who knew they'd just dodged a disaster. Theo clapped him on the shoulder and told him he'd pulled a rabbit out of a hat again, and for one unguarded moment Marcus let himself hope that maybe, this time, it would actually be acknowledged. Vivian called a meeting the next morning to celebrate the win. The conference room filled with the leadership team and half the staff, everyone pleased, everyone expecting the account to be held up as proof of what the company could do. Marcus sat near the middle of the table, not at the head, telling himself he didn't need to hear his name out loud. He only needed the thing to be true. It was true. That should have been enough. Vivian stood at the front and walked the room through the save like she was narrating a film about her own instincts. She described how she'd spotted the danger early, how she'd known the pricing was wrong, how she'd directed the recovery. She used the word "we" the way powerful people use it when they mean "I," and with every retelling one more of Marcus's fingerprints disappeared from the story, until by the end he'd become little more than a pair of hands that typed what she'd supposedly dictated. He might have let even that go. He'd let worse go before. But then someone from the client's team asked, honestly and without any edge, who had actually caught the pricing error, because they wanted to send a note of thanks. It was a simple question with an obvious answer, and the whole room knew it. For one suspended second, the answer hung in the air, waiting to be spoken. Vivian smiled and said these things were never about one person. That she didn't believe in singling people out, that the real strength of Cross Enterprises had always been that nobody was irreplaceable. She said it looking directly at Marcus, and everyone understood exactly where that last part had been aimed. Theo's jaw tightened. Somewhere down the table a chair creaked as someone shifted, uncomfortable, and said nothing. Something in Marcus's chest went very still. Not only anger. The quiet arrival of a fact he'd spent years refusing to look at directly. No amount of good work would ever be enough, because being seen was never something she intended to allow. He had been solving her problems in exchange for a respect that was never coming, and he'd been calling that arrangement a job. Vivian wasn't finished. Maybe she read his stillness as the old submission and wanted to press her advantage. Maybe she just liked the audience. She set both hands on the table, leaned in, and let her voice take on the light, cutting tone she saved for lessons she wanted to land in front of witnesses. Let's be clear about something, she said, sweeping her eyes across the room before landing back on him. Loyalty isn't the same as leverage. Some people confuse being useful with being important. She let that sit. Marcus does good work. Marcus also knows exactly what a man in his position is worth on the open market. Which is why Marcus is never going anywhere. Isn't that right? He didn't answer right away, and the silence stretched long enough that a few people looked down at their hands. Then she pushed the folder a few inches across the table, a small gesture of dismissal, and delivered the line she'd clearly been saving. You think anyone out there would pay you what I pay you? If you're so good, quit. I dare you. You won't. The room didn't breathe. It was one thing to diminish a man's contribution privately. It was another to stand in front of 40 people and dare him to leave. Even the leadership team seemed to sense she'd stepped across a line that wouldn't be easy to step back over. Vivian looked completely certain. She'd run the numbers on him 1,000 times in her head, a man with obligations, a single income, a mortgage, a life built on the reliability of that paycheck. He'd flush. He'd go quiet. He'd stay. They always stayed. Marcus looked at her for a long moment, and what crossed his face wasn't what she expected. No flush. No scramble. No fear. Something closer to relief, the look of a man who'd finally been given permission to stop pretending. He squared the papers in front of him into a neat stack out of habit, and stood. All right, he said. Just that. 2 words, unhurried. Then he walked out of the conference room while it was still silent behind him. For several seconds nobody understood what had happened. Vivian let out a short laugh and told the room to take 5, waving a hand like the whole thing had been theater she'd staged on purpose. She believed it, too certain he'd gone to splash water on his face and come back with his eyes down, certain the story would end the way it always ended, with her proven right about human nature. But Marcus didn't go to the restroom. He went to his desk, stopping at a supply closet on the way for a flat paper box, and began filling it. He wrapped the small brass clock that had sat on his desk since his first week. He took the pen his first mentor had given him, the potted plant that had survived 7 years on his windowsill, and the coffee mug that had lost its handle and been glued back together twice. Theo appeared at the edge of the desk, caught somewhere between alarm and admiration. "Marcus," he said quietly, keeping his voice down. "Man, don't let her do this. She'll say anything for a reaction. Walk it off, come back in an hour, she'll pretend it never happened." "I know she will," Marcus said, not pausing. He worked with the same calm efficiency he brought to everything, and somehow that calm was more final than any outburst could have been. "That's the problem, Theo. She'll pretend it never happened, and then it'll happen again, and I'll pretend too. And one day I'll look up and realize I taught everyone in this building that this is how you get treated when you're good at your job." Theo had no answer for that, because it was true, and he'd felt the edges of that same truth himself. He watched Marcus lift the box, test its weight, then set it down again to sign one last document, a resignation letter, one handwritten page, no complaints, no explanation. Marcus had drafted a version of that letter in his head 100 times over the years without ever believing he'd write it. Writing it for real took less than 2 minutes. Word moved through the floor the way bad news always does, quietly and fast. By the time Marcus carried the box toward the elevators, a good portion of the staff had drifted out of their seats to watch. Nobody spoke. There was a strange gravity to it. The most capable person any of them had worked with, carrying the whole of his tenure out in a container that had once held printer paper. Vivian came out of the conference room in time to see the elevator doors. She'd expected to find him back at his desk, chastened, and instead found her entire staff standing in silence and a paper box in his hands. For a fraction of a second something crossed her face that she would have denied later, a flicker of real uncertainty. Then she smoothed it into the expression she wore for the board and the press. "Well," she said, loud enough for the floor to hear, "I suppose we'll find out how good he really is." A thin smile. "Give it a week. He'll call. They always call." She turned back toward her office as if the matter were closed, as if the number she'd run on him couldn't possibly be wrong. Marcus left the resignation letter on the corner of the reception desk on his way past. It felt cleaner than mailing it. He didn't look back at the office, and he didn't look back at her. The elevator doors slid open, and in the polished metal he caught his own blurred reflection holding the box, a man who had just walked away from the safest thing in his life with no plan, no guarantee, and no idea whether he'd just been brave or foolish. The doors closed. The floor numbers began to fall. Somewhere above him, Vivian Cross was already telling herself the story in which she came out right. Somewhere below, a city full of people he'd never met was about to find out exactly what he could do. When the credit for his work finally had nowhere else to go, he didn't feel triumphant. That was the part no one upstairs would have understood. He felt the cold, clear weight of everything. He was now solely responsible for obligations that didn't care about his pride, bills that would arrive on schedule whether or not he'd proven a point. But underneath the fear was something he hadn't felt in years, something that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with the man in the reflection. For the first time in a long time, he had stopped enduring. Whatever came next would be his. The first week went exactly the way Vivian predicted, and she made sure everyone knew she'd predicted it. When no message came Monday, she said he was being proud. When none came Wednesday, she said pride was expensive and he'd learn that soon enough. By Friday she'd stopped mentioning him at all, which she framed as indifference, but which the floor correctly read as the first sign his silence was starting to bother her. The second week didn't go the way the first had. Nothing dramatic happened, a great many small things simply stopped happening, the invisible maintenance Marcus had performed for years without anyone logging it. A client email went 3 days without the kind of answer that used to arrive within the hour. A proposal went out with a pricing structure nobody had thought to double-check. A junior analyst spent an entire afternoon stuck on a problem Marcus would have untangled before lunch, with no one left to ask. Theo felt the gap most directly, since he was the one people came to now, and he was honest enough with himself to know he was standing in a doorway built for a bigger man. He did his best. He stayed late. He answered what he could and covered for what he couldn't, but covering wasn't the same as solving, and the distance between those two words widened a little more every day. Vivian noticed the way you notice weather, first as a change in the light, only later as a storm. The account Marcus had saved began wobbling again within weeks, because the recovery he'd engineered needed a steady hand to maintain and no steady hand remained. The client, sensing drift, cooled. A different account, one nobody had been watching, quietly slid toward a competitor while everyone's attention was elsewhere. She responded the way she always responded, by working harder and demanding everyone around her do the same. She sat in on meetings she used to skip. She rewrote proposals herself late into the night and discovered that the parts she'd always assumed were easy had only looked easy because someone else had made them look that way. She would never have said this out loud to a living soul, but alone in her office with the city dark below her, she began to understand exactly what had walked out carrying a paper box. She learned where he'd gone around the end of the third week and learned it the worst possible way, from a client instead of a rumor. She was on a call trying to reassure a nervous account when the man on the other end mentioned, almost in passing, that he'd recently spoken with Marcus Dean about some strategy work. Did she know Marcus had started his own firm? He said it warmly, the way you mention a mutual acquaintance, with no idea each word was landing like a stone. Vivian kept her voice level through the rest of the call. The moment it ended, she set the phone down very carefully, as if a loud sound might make the thing more true. Marcus hadn't gone home to lick his wounds. He hadn't spent 3 weeks composing an apology. He'd spent them building something, quietly, and the first she heard of it was a client casually telling her that her best strategist was now available to the entire market. The firm was small at first, barely more than Marcus, a phone, and a rented desk in a shared workspace. But small wasn't the same as struggling, and struggling was what she'd been counting on. She'd built her entire prediction on the assumption that his value came from the platform she'd given him, that without the Cross Enterprises name behind him, he'd be just another consultant sending emails nobody answered. It had never once occurred to her that the name people actually trusted might have been his all along. For his part, Marcus didn't experience those first weeks as triumph. He experienced them as fear held at arm's length by work. The obligations he'd walked away from didn't shrink just because he'd made a brave choice. There were nights he sat with a spreadsheet of his own finances and felt the full cold arithmetic of what he'd done. A man doesn't undo 7 years of depending on a salary in a month. There were mornings he woke long before dawn and lay in the dark doing math on how long his savings would last if the phone never rang. But the phone did ring. It rang because of something Vivian had never understood about him. In 7 years of saving her accounts, Marcus had been building relationships she'd assumed belonged to the company. The clients he'd talked down off ledges remembered who had actually talked them down. The people who'd watched him fix what others broke remembered his name, not the logo on his card. When word got around that he'd gone independent, a handful of them didn't hesitate. Because they'd never been loyal to Cross Enterprises at all. They'd been loyal to him. His first real client was a mid-sized company that had worked with Cross Enterprises years earlier and left unhappy for reasons they'd never quite been able to name until Marcus sat across from them and named those reasons precisely. He walked them through exactly where their old strategy had gone wrong and what he'd do differently, without a single slide about himself, and they signed within the week. It wasn't a fortune. It was enough to prove the one thing he most needed proven: the value had never lived in the building he'd left. The work suited him in a way the old work never had, because for the first time, credit and responsibility sat in the same pair of hands. When something went well, no one could take it from him. When something went badly, there was no one to blame it on, and he found he preferred that arrangement even on the days it frightened him. Back at Cross Enterprises, the shape of the problem was becoming impossible to reframe. Quarterly revenue came in soft, and soft was a word Vivian's board didn't like hearing. 2 of the accounts that slipped had been long-standing, the kind assumed permanent. When leadership tried to trace why, the honest answer kept circling back to a single absence nobody wanted to name in front of her. Priya Nolan, one of the sharper minds left on the strategy team, was the first to draw the obvious conclusion and act on it. She'd watched the conference room scene along with the rest of the floor, and she'd taken from it a lesson Vivian would never have wanted taught. If the best of them could be dared to quit and discarded with a smile, loyalty in that building bought a person nothing. Priya had a career to think about. She didn't make a scene. She simply took a call from a recruiter she'd have ignored a month earlier, and started listening. The mood on the floor curdled into something Vivian could feel but not command. People still did their work, but with a kind of quiet reserve, holding part of themselves back the way you do in a place you've decided not to trust. They'd all understood, watching Marcus go, that the company would rather humiliate its best than admit it needed him, and there's no memo that undoes a lesson like that once the staff has learned it. Vivian tried to solve the problem the way she solved every problem, by throwing resources at it. She authorized an expensive search for a senior strategist to replace what she'd lost, and interviewed one impressive candidate after another, each of whom failed to be what she was actually looking for. They could read a market, build a deck, speak confidently in a room, but none of them had the particular instinct for a client on the edge, the ability to hear the fear underneath an email and answer it before it became a decision. She'd assumed that instinct was common. She was learning it wasn't. Across the city, in a rented office that was already starting to feel too small, Marcus closed his laptop on another day that had ended better than it began. His firm had a name now, a second client, and a third close to signing. The fear hadn't vanished just because the work was going well, but it had changed character. There's a difference between the fear of a man who's been trapped and the fear of a man who's taken a risk, even if from the outside they can look the same. He'd come to know which one he was living inside now. He didn't think about Vivian often, which would have surprised her, since she'd started thinking about him constantly. When he did think of her, it was without heat, the way you think of weather you've finally driven out of. He didn't want her to fail. He didn't need her to. He'd discovered that what he'd really been chasing all those years wasn't revenge, or even recognition, but the ordinary dignity of being valued for what he brought, and he had that now, somewhere his work belonged to him. The distance between them had become a kind of ledger, settling a little more clearly in his favor every week, not because he'd schemed for it, but because the truth has weight of its own once nobody's left to press a thumb on the scale. Vivian had built her prediction on the assumption that he needed the company. It was turning out the company had needed him, and the market was doing the accounting she'd refused to do herself. She was going to have to come to him. She didn't fully know it yet, though some part of her had already begun to suspect it on that dark night at her desk. No candidate was coming who could fill the shape he'd left. No version of next quarter would fix itself. There was only one person who'd ever been able to do what the company suddenly couldn't, and he was 3 miles away in a rented office, building something that didn't carry her name and didn't need to. The only question left was how much more it would cost her before she was willing to close the distance herself, and whether, once she stood in his doorway with her pride in her hands, there'd be anything left that he still wanted from her. It took another 6 weeks for Vivian to run out of every other option, and she exhausted them in order, the way a proud person always does. She hired the most impressive candidate from her search and watched him fail to hold an account he didn't understand. She lowered her prices to keep a client who left anyway. She called in favors that had only ever been favors as long as she was winning. When the last of it was spent, she sat alone in her office one evening with an address written on a slip of paper, and understood there was nothing left to try except the one thing she'd sworn she'd never do. She didn't tell Diane. She didn't tell the board. She drove herself across the city the next morning, itself a strange thing, since she was a woman who was usually driven places. And found the shared workspace tucked between a coffee roaster and a bank branch, on a street she'd never had a single reason to visit. The building had none of the polish of the tower she owned: exposed brick, mismatched chairs, a front desk staffed by someone who didn't recognize her name. She gave it anyway, and asked for Marcus Dean. He came out to meet her himself, which she hadn't expected. She'd pictured being made to wait, kept at a distance as a small revenge. Instead, he walked into the lobby in a plain shirt with his sleeves rolled up, and looked at her with an expression that held no triumph in it at all. That was the part that unsettled her most. She'd come braced for gloating, and its absence made her feel the whole weight of the visit more sharply than any insult could have. He showed her back to a modest conference room, offered her water, and sat across from her without hurry. The office around them was small but alive. Phones ringing, two people arguing amiably over a whiteboard through the glass, the particular energy of a place that's growing. She'd walked in intending to be gracious from a position of strength, and somewhere between the front desk and this chair, the position of strength had quietly changed hands. She began with the version she'd rehearsed in the car, the one that framed her visit as an opportunity she was generously extending. She told him the company had grown in directions that needed his particular talents. She told him she'd been thinking about how things ended and felt some of it had been unfair. She offered him his old role back, and when his face gave her nothing, she offered more: a senior title, a seat closer to the decisions, a salary well above what he'd made before. Marcus listened without interrupting. When she finished, he didn't answer right away. He turned his water glass a quarter turn on the table, and the small, ordinary gesture made clear he was considering how to say the thing, not whether to say it. When he spoke, his voice was as level as it had been the day he walked out, and it carried the same finality. "I appreciate that you drove out here," he said. "I know what it cost you to do it. I'm not going to pretend I don't." He met her eyes, no heat in his own. "But the answer is no." Vivian had prepared for reluctance. She hadn't prepared for a refusal delivered that plainly, and her first instinct, the one that had always served her, was to raise the number. She said she could go higher on salary. She said equity was on the table, real equity, the kind she didn't usually offer. She said whatever he thought he was building here, she could give him a larger version of it inside a company that already had scale. It was never about the number, Marcus said, and the quiet in his voice stopped her more effectively than volume could have. "That's the part one don't think you've understood yet, and I'm not saying it to hurt you. I stayed for years because of the number. I told myself the money was worth what I had to swallow to earn it. I was wrong, and it took me a long time to see how wrong." He leaned forward slightly, not in aggression but in something closer to honesty, as if he'd decided she deserved the whole truth rather than the polite half-portions people usually traded. "I didn't leave because you underpaid me. You didn't. I left because I was tired of being good at my job in a place where being good at my job meant standing there while someone told the room I hadn't done it. I left because I got tired of a kind of respect I had to earn back every single morning and lose again by the afternoon. You can't put that on the table, Vivian. It isn't a number. It's a thing you either extend to people or you don't. For 7 years, you decided not to." The words weren't cruel, and that was what made them land. If he'd shouted them, she could have defended herself against the shouting. Delivered evenly, with no wish to wound, they left her nothing to push against. She sat in the mismatched chair in the borrowed conference room and understood, finally and completely, that she hadn't lost an employee over money. She'd lost him over the one currency she'd never learned to spend. She tried once more, and even as she did, she heard how thin it sounded, that people said things in meetings, that pressure made everyone sharp, that surely he understood the demands of running a company that size. Marcus let her finish, then shook his head gently, "The way you correct someone you've stopped being angry at." "I do understand them," he said. "I understood them the whole time. That's why I stayed as long as I did. But I'm not going to build my life around a place that only sees my value the moment it's gone. I have that value now, somewhere my work is mine. I'm not giving that back for a bigger office." There was nothing left to offer after that, and Vivian was too intelligent not to know it. She gathered herself with the discipline that had carried her through 1,000 harder rooms, thanked him for his time in a voice that was almost steady, and stood to leave. At the door of the little conference room, she stopped, and for once she wasn't managing the moment or steering it toward an outcome. She simply looked at him. "You're right," she said, and the admission cost her something visible. "I did decide not to. I'm not sure I even knew I was deciding it." Then she left, and Marcus watched her go without satisfaction, because being proven right about something that had cost him 7 years wasn't the same as winning. The drive back was long, and Vivian didn't turn on the radio. The refusal had done something the falling numbers hadn't quite managed. The numbers had told her she'd made an expensive mistake. Marcus, in his plain shirt in his growing office, had told her what kind of mistake it was, and the two things weren't the same. One could be fixed with a good quarter. The other went to the root of how she'd run everything and everyone for as long as she'd held power. The weeks that followed were the hardest she'd known in years, and hard in a way that had nothing to do with revenue. The revenue was a symptom. The disease was that she'd built a company people served but didn't trust, and now that the fear had cracked, the service was cracking with it. Priya Nolan handed in her resignation not long after, calmly, and when Vivian asked why, Priya told her the truth in a way no one on staff had ever dared before. "I watched what happened to the best person here," she said, standing with her letter already on the desk. "You dared him to leave and then you smiled about it. I've spent every day since wondering what you'd do to the rest of us the moment we stopped being useful to you. I don't want to find out." She wasn't angry. She was clear, and clarity was harder to argue with than anger. Vivian let her go without the counteroffer she'd once have made reflexively. Two more capable people followed within the month, each for reasons that traced back to the same afternoon in the conference room. Vivian found herself presiding over a company hollowing out from the middle, losing exactly the people it could least afford to lose, and she understood at last that she couldn't hire her way out of a culture she'd built with her own hands. The problem had never been a missing strategist. The problem was the reason the strategist had left, and that reason was her. Theo Marsh was one of the few who stayed, though not out of blind loyalty. He stayed because he'd watched Marcus leave and decided he wanted to see whether the place could become something worth staying for, and because someone who remembered how it used to be needed to be in the room while it changed. Vivian noticed him differently now. She began leaning on him the way she should have leaned on people all along, by asking instead of dictating, and Theo, to his own surprise, found the doorway he'd once felt too small for was one he could grow into once no one was standing on his shoulders. She did the only thing that had any real chance of matching: she stopped. She stopped rewriting other people's work and putting her name on it. Awkwardly at first, she began saying the names of the people who'd actually done things, out loud, in rooms where it counted. It felt unnatural, like using a hand she'd never trained, and more than once she caught the flicker of suspicion on a staffer's face, the reasonable doubt of someone who'd learned not to trust kindness from her. She'd earned that doubt, and she made herself sit inside it instead of demanding it disappear. Diane noticed the change before anyone else, because she'd been watching for it. She came to the office again, months after her first warning, and this time she took the offered coffee and stayed a while. What she said wasn't a lecture. "It's slower than losing them was," she observed, turning the cup in her hands. "That's how it always goes. You can lose trust in an afternoon. You buy it back a day at a time, and some of it you don't buy back at all." She looked at Vivian with something that wasn't quite warmth, but wasn't only judgment anymore, either. "But you're doing it. That's more than I expected." The company never recovered to what it had been. Vivian made peace with a smaller, steadier version of the thing she'd built, one that no longer ran on fear, and so no longer ran quite as hot. But the people who stayed slowly began holding a little less of themselves back, and the difference was real even when it wasn't dramatic. She was becoming a leader she wouldn't have recognized a year earlier, for the plainest possible reason: the other way had failed in front of her own eyes, and this was the only way left. Across the city, Marcus's firm kept growing, and the growth had a shape that reflected the man running it. He hired carefully, and the people he brought on quickly discovered this was a place where the person who did the work was the person whose name got said. When something went well, he told the client exactly whose idea it had been. When something went wrong, he stood in front of it himself. He was building, deliberately and without announcing it, the precise opposite of the room he'd walked out of, and the people who worked for him could feel the difference before they had words for it. Julian Ross, who ran a company several times the size of anything Marcus had handled alone before, became the client who turned the firm from a promising thing into a real one. He'd heard Marcus's name from two people he trusted, done the kind of careful checking men in his position do, and been convinced by what he found. He brought Marcus a problem that was genuinely hard, the kind that could have gone badly and taken the young firm's reputation down with it. There were nights Marcus lay awake running the numbers on what a failure at that scale would mean. He didn't fail. He did the work the way he always had, without shortcuts and without theater, and delivered a result that made Julian Ross a client for years rather than a project. That single account did more than pay the bills. It proved the thing Marcus had built could carry real weight, that the value people trusted had genuinely been his, and not the borrowed shine of a glass tower. The last of the old fear finally began to loosen its grip. He and Vivian crossed paths again almost a year after he'd left, at an industry event neither of them could have gracefully skipped. He saw her across a crowded room, and the sight didn't tighten anything in his chest the way it once would have. She was talking with a small group, and watching for a moment, he noticed her doing something he'd never once seen her do in 7 years, crediting someone else. She'd turned to a younger colleague and was telling the group plainly that the work they were discussing had been that colleague's idea, unprompted, without making a performance of it. They spoke briefly later that evening, the way two people speak when a great deal has passed between them and most of it no longer needs saying. She told him the firm's reputation had reached her, that she was glad it was going well, and she meant it, he could tell. He thanked her, and meant it too. There was no grand reconciliation, no offer renewed, no closing of the distance that had opened between them. There was only a mutual, quiet respect that had been impossible while one of them held power over the other, and had become possible the moment neither of them did. "I owe you something," she said near the end of it, without drama. "Not a job, I know better than that now. I owe you the thing I should have said in that meeting and didn't. You were the best I ever had, and I spent all my energy making sure you never knew it. That was the mistake. It just took losing you to teach it to me." Marcus took the words the way he took most things, without needing to make them into more than they were. He told her he was glad she'd learned it, and that he hoped the people working for her now got the version of her that finally understood. Then the conversation found its natural end, and they moved back into their separate evenings. He didn't stay to watch her leave. He had nothing left to prove to her, and more importantly, nothing left to prove to himself. He walked out into the cool night with the ordinary tiredness of a man who'd built something real and would be back at it in the morning. He thought briefly about the version of himself who'd stood in that conference room a year earlier, holding a stack of papers and a decision he hadn't been sure was brave or foolish. He knew the answer now. It had been both. The way most decisions that matter are both. And it had been the right one anyway. The lesson, in the end, belonged mostly to Vivian, and she carried it into the smaller, better company she was slowly learning to run. A business can purchase talent with a high enough salary, but talent isn't the same as loyalty, and loyalty can't be bought at any price. It's extended in exchange for respect, freely and daily, or it isn't extended at all. She'd learned it the most expensive way a person can learn anything, by watching the proof of it walk into an elevator with a paper box and never come back. And the truth underneath it was simpler still, simple enough that Marcus had understood it long before she did. Never measure a person's worth by their circumstances, and never believe money alone will hold someone who's stopped being respected. Treat people with dignity and they'll give you everything they have. Wound their self-respect, and sooner or later they'll find the courage to build something of their own, and they'll build it without you.